Samuel chapter 31 is where we are today. 1 Samuel chapter 31. It's going to take me a little bit to get into the chapter. A couple of thoughts from last week. Let me see, this isn't right. A couple of thoughts from last week just to remember where we were. Chapter 30 talks about David. Remember, for the last 5 or 6 chapters, we've seen a chapter about David, then a chapter about Saul. We've seen a chapter of obedience, a chapter of disobedience. And it's gone back and forth, flipped back and forth. We're making our final flip today in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 31, as Saul will meet his end on Mount Gilboa. He'll be killed today by a Philistine arrow. But last week in chapter 30, we were talking about David. We were down south. I'm talking about geographically on a map. We were down south in Ziklag with David. He returned there. This is David's story. He returned there at the command of Achish, the Philistine king of Gath. And David and his 600 men found their wives and children had been taken captive by the Amalekites. This is what we've been looking at the last couple of weeks. David, realizing that his family was gone, they'd been taken captive, immediately bows his knee to Yahweh, asking, "What shall I do? What do you intend me to do?" So David sought direction from Yahweh, and Yahweh, or God, told him to pursue the raiders. God promised David victory. Go after the Amalekites, chase them down. I'm going to give you everything that they took from you, including your wives and your children. So David, by the mighty hand of God, recovered all that had been taken from him. This was chapter 30. Now in chapter 31, the scene shifts back to the north parts of Israel, the valley of Jezreel, and the mountain called Gilboa. This is the mountain on which Saul will die. This is the mountain that David will curse because Saul's blood was spilled on it. And so the scene in chapter 31 shifts back to the north to continue the activities of King Saul and the Philistines. Remember, the Philistine army, with David marching behind them, were on their way to the Jezreel Valley to fight when the 4 Philistine kings told this guy Achish, "Why is this Jew with us? We're going to fight the Jews, but you have invited a Jew to the battle with us." And so David has gone back to Ziklag, but the story continues up in the north. The Philistine armies are marching on Israel. That's what we're seeing. 1 Samuel chapter 31, as I said, we're going to see King Saul die. Now, only God is in control of life and death. This is God taking King Saul's life. His days are numbered, just like my days are numbered, just like your days are numbered, and he will meet his last day. He will live his last day on earth very soon. But my question as we get started this morning is, why did Saul go into battle when Samuel told him not to? Why is Saul going to fight the Philistines? Remember, he went to the witch of Endor, Saul did, and he was told by Samuel, who God allowed to bring up. But Saul was very clearly told by Samuel, "You're going to die. The Lord is not with you. Yahweh is no longer guiding you and leading you. He's no longer your strength. You've abandoned him, so he's gone." But why does Saul wake up and go into battle against the Philistines when it has been decreed that he's going to die? If you go into battle, you will die. I'm wondering if Saul thought that he could override Yahweh's decree. I can beat the rap. Look what it says, just as a backdrop to this question. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, this is Samuel having been called back up from Sheol, from Abraham's bosom. Samuel is in the presence of Saul in the witch of Endor's little place. And Samuel says this to Saul. Did Saul not hear this? We know he heard it. He lamented over it. He mourned over these words. Why then did he go into battle? Samuel asks Saul, "Why then do you ask me, since Yahweh has departed from you and has become your enemy, your adversary? The Lord has done accordingly as He spoke through me. He has ripped the kingdom out of your hands and will hand it to your servant David. It's been decreed. It's finished. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David." In verse 19 it says this, "Moreover," those are truths, let me give you more. "More than that, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow, less than 24 hours will pass, Saul, and you will die in battle." Why would you wake up the next day and go into battle unless you thought, I can change God's mind? I can manipulate this God. I can make God do what I want Him to do. Not what He wants to do, not what He has decreed that He will do. I can change God's mind. Watch me do it. Ever been that foolish? "Indeed, the Lord will give the army," he says, "Therefore, because Yahweh is not with you, therefore tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." What does that mean? "But you will die." Samuel is a dead man whose soul and spirit have now been called up and are speaking to Saul. And Samuel the prophet, through the words of God, is telling Saul, tomorrow you will die and your sons will die, all in battle on Mount Gilboa. Why would you wake up in the morning, put on your armor, and go into battle? "Indeed, the Lord will give over the entire army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." So Saul's sin here has fingers. It's not only consequential to Saul, everything he's done in his life, but the whole Jewish army will suffer because of Saul's disobedience, and the next day many in the army will perish because Saul will lead them into a battle that God decreed through Samuel, you will lose. I'll wipe you out tomorrow. So the question remains, why would Saul wake up in the morning and go into battle? He was sentenced to death by Yahweh through Yahweh's prophet Samuel. It's as clear as can be. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. But he refused to believe it. Disobedient, arrogant. He refused to believe that it could be true that tomorrow the great leader of men, Saul, could be killed. So he woke up the next day, the day of his decreed death, decreed by his Creator who gave him life, who now says, this mortal life is over, tomorrow I will take you. He wakes up, this Saul, the next day, and he fully expected to win in battle. He certainly didn't go into battle to die. He went into battle to win as the king of Israel. Sinful men, the sinful heart can drive us to do unbelievably foolish things. He thinks he's going to live another day. I want to ask a question and look at something from the Scriptures. The next question for the morning is, has anything else ever happened like this in Israel? Has Israel, I'm asking you to go back into your minds and what you know about the Old Testament and the Jewish story. Jews' relationship with God. Has anything like this ever happened in Israel before? That there would be a decree from God that things will be bad, yet the Jewish men refuse to believe that it could be true. They think they can change God's mind. They think they can manipulate their Creator and they can have their way, not God's way. And they wake up the next day and march into battle. Has it ever happened in Israel before? Does Saul know this history of his people? Of course Saul knows it. But instead of learning from it, Saul wakes up the next day and goes into battle. I want to show you a couple of verses. This exact thing, not something like it, exactly this has happened before to the Jewish people. Numbers chapter 14, verse 39, when Moses spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, not just Saul, but here's the prophet Moses speaking a word to all of the sons of Israel, the people mourned greatly, just like when Samuel told Saul, the Lord is not with you, do not go into battle. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me in paradise, in Abraham's bosom, in Sheol. Saul mourned. He realized this is bad. His death had just been decreed. This has happened before. Exactly. Anybody know what the event is in Numbers chapter 14? In Numbers chapter 13, there were 12 men that were chosen by Israel to go into the land. Remember the story of the 12 spies who spied out the land of Israel? That's where we are in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. What happened when the spies came back? Two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, said, we can take them if the Lord is with them, if the Lord will fight our battle, and we know He will. We need to immediately tomorrow march into the land and do what God tells us to do. He will drive out the nations that are greater and stronger from before us. The battle is the Lord's, not ours. We're ready to go. Wake up and let's move. Caleb and Joshua. But there were 10 other spies, weren't there? And the 10 other spies said, oh no, we can't do it. There are giants in the land. The cities are too fortified. Which to me sounds like they're saying Yahweh is not strong enough to defeat their gods. We are fearful that Yahweh can pull off what He says He can do. We will not wake up in the morning and go into battle against these people. We will not. We refuse. And all Israel decided to follow the bad advice of the 10 bad spies instead of following the courageous men, Caleb and Joshua. And when Moses got the message from God, he delivers it to the people. What was the message? Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice. What was God's voice? I will drive out these nations before you. I'll even send the hornet in. I'll take them out slowly so that the wild beasts of the land don't overpower you. But I am giving you the land that I promised the Jew. I promised Abraham, I promised Isaac, I promised Jacob. I am now going to deliver on my promise. I'm putting you into the promised land, the land of Canaan, and you will have safety here. Trust me, I'm stronger than anything in the world. I will defeat the enemy. I will allow you to defeat the enemy. But because you didn't listen to my voice, because you didn't trust me, trust my strength, trust that I am a God who created everything I'm telling you I'm going to defeat, because you wouldn't listen and have continuously tested me, even after I showed you in Egypt with the strongest nation on the earth at the time, with the strongest army ever assembled to date on earth at the time, the Egyptian army, even when I showed you through 10 plagues that I control everything, even when I parted the Red Sea for you, even when I gave you manna in the wilderness, water from the rock, quail from the east, even when I provided everything for you, you still don't trust me. And there's a consequence to that. This generation of men, the first generation we call them, the people that walked out of Egypt are the first generation. Their children are the second generation. But the first generation of men, God decreed this. You wouldn't listen to Joshua and Caleb like you should have. You didn't listen to me. You didn't listen to Moses like you should have. You listened to the 10 weak spies, the cowards. There's a consequence to that. These men shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers. Their fathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. God is telling them, you refuse to believe that I could deliver the promised land to you against the giants, against the fortified cities. You refuse to believe that I'm a strong enough God to do what I promise I'll do. And because you don't believe me, you'll all die in the wilderness instead. You've chosen this. So over the next 40 years, God decrees that He would kill all the men of this first generation that left Egypt. Now remember, the Bible says there were 603,550 men who left Egypt. Jewish men, 603,550. All of those men, over a 40-year period, will die in the wilderness except for 2. All of them, including Aaron and Moses. All of them will die in the wilderness. 603,548 men will die over the next 40 years because they listened to 10 Jewish men tell them, we're too afraid to go into the land tomorrow. 603,548 men would be killed by God because they followed the advice of 10 men. You catching that? But what was their response? None of you will go into the land. I have decreed it. You will not step foot over the Jordan River and enter the land I promised Abraham. Not going to happen. All of you will die over the next 40 years. 38 years are all that's left now. But what was their response to God's words? That's the question that we're trying to get after. After the mourning, the crying wore off, what was their response? Look what it says in verse 40. Numbers 14, verse 40. Now remember, we're bouncing off of Saul, who's told by Samuel, tomorrow you're going to die in battle. The Philistines are going to destroy the Jewish army, and you and your sons will all die. In the morning, Saul wakes up, puts on his armor, and walks into battle, which I would call insanity. But the Jewish men have done it before. God has decreed you will not enter the land for your disobedience, for not trusting me. And what does it say in Numbers 14:40? In the morning, very next day, 24 hours haven't passed. And what does Jewish male arrogance talk the army into? We can manipulate God. We can change His mind. Listen to how they do it. This is sinister. It says, in the morning, however, they rose up early. All the sons of Israel is who the they is. They rose up early. They went up to the ridge of the hill country. And this is what was on their mind. These are their thoughts. Here we are. We have indeed sinned. What do you call that? That statement. Confession. Listen to the manipulation. Listen to how they're trying to manipulate God and His decree that all of you are going to die in the wilderness. None of you are going to enter the land, not one of you, except for Joshua and Caleb. Listen to how they try to manipulate our God. Have you ever done this? Try to get around something? We have sinned, so we confess that. But we will go up to the place which the Lord, listen to the words, has promised. You see the manipulation? We're sinners. We agree. We confess. But you made a promise, and we're going to hold you to it. Not good. They admit their wrongdoing, they admit their sin, and they think this will clear the air with God and all will be fine. What they forget is that sometimes there are lingering consequences to our sins. Right? Some things you sin, you confess them, and they're truly gone. But some things are have more, as I just mentioned, fingers that stretch out and affect others, and there are ongoing consequences to our sin. I'll give you one example because it just pops into my head, and we're talking about David and Bathsheba. You remember the story. She's bathing. He's a king who should have led his army out to battle. It's the springtime, but instead David stays home. He sees the beauty bathing. He takes the beauty. It's good to be king, right? He can have anything he wants. In a sinful way, he takes Bathsheba, forces himself upon her, gets her pregnant, then tries to cover up this illicit affair by having her husband come, Uriah the Hittite. Bring Uriah back from the battlefield where I should be. Bring Uriah back. I'll have Uriah lay with his wife as he would, as any married man would, who's been away from his wife for a while. But Uriah won't do it because he's an honorable man. And if his men are in the field and they're not having the relations with their wives, then neither will Uriah take that opportunity. And Uriah won't do it. For 2 days, Uriah won't do it. David gets him drunk, which is another sin. David gets him drunk and tries to send him back to his wife, but the man won't do it. So what does David do? He has Uriah put on the front lines of battle where he will die in battle. He's guilty of infidelity, he's guilty of adultery, and he's guilty of planning a murder. Premeditated murder, David. He comes to God and confesses his sins. Does God forgive him his sins or not? Well, yes, he does. Because that's what he promises he'll do. David confesses his sins and God forgives David. But are there consequences beyond just mere forgiveness and all the air is clean and now things will just work perfectly out in your life? Or are there consequences? What happens to Bathsheba's baby? She carries this child to term, David's first child with Bathsheba. She carries him to term. She gives birth to the child. And the Bible tells us that God killed that child because of the disobedience of David. There was a consequence to the sin. Yes, I forgive you, son. But there's a punishment that's going to go along with this. And here we have Israel in the wilderness thinking, if we just confess our sins, everything will go back to the way it was. No consequences beyond this. God says, oh, no, wait. You misunderstand when I make a decree. I forgive you, but you're not going to step foot in the land of Canaan, not one of you. You will not manipulate me. You will not make me change my mind. The Lord is not a man who can change his mind. You will not manipulate me into some situation, even bringing up a promise I made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not going to work. I've issued a decree. Sinister. It really is devious what they're thinking in their heads, that they can outsmart God. Don't ever try to outsmart or outmaneuver God. There's only one way that can end, and that's disaster for you. God chooses on whom to show mercy, and He chooses on whom not to show mercy, and that's God's prerogative, not ours. We can't move the hand of God in this regard. And here we see them reminding Yahweh that He made a promise to Abraham. This is probably, to me, the most sinister part. You made a promise to Abraham to give us this land. Here we are. We're ready. We're on the hillside, ready to press forward. What they failed to remember is their disobedience and lack of trust in Yahweh to protect them as they entered the land. What about the 10 spies? What about your fears? What about your proclamations, O Israel, that I wasn't strong enough to give you the land? What about all that? There's consequences to those sins. Lingering, ongoing consequences. The promise to Abraham. Were there any strings attached when God promised Abraham, I will give you this land, I will make your descendants as the sand of the seashore, innumerable in number, I will make you a great nation? Were there any conditions on those promises. That in you, Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, and I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. Israel will be preeminent among all the nations of the world. Was there anything God told Abraham, but only if you do this? The Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapter 12. Were there any conditions that Abraham had to meet, or was it an unconditional promise of God to Abraham? What was it? It was unconditional. It was unconditional. These were promises God made Abraham, regardless of what Abraham did. This land, the seed, all the world will be blessed by you is unconditional, can't be changed, decreed by God in His plan, etched in stone. The Jews would be preeminent. But to be in the land and enjoy the blessings of the land, now that's conditional. I don't mean that Israel won't own the land forever. They will. But whether they're in the land enjoying the blessings or kicked out of the land like to Assyria or to Babylon for 70 years, that's based on Israel's decisions. Being in the land and enjoying it for whatever time period is Israel's choice. And that's what they have failed to see. You made a promise to Abraham that was unconditional. You have to let us into this land. But entering the land and living peacefully in the land was conditional. If you obey, you'll live long in the land. Remember one of the 10 Commandments. Let me read it to you. Maybe it'll make more sense now why it's written the way it is. It's in the book of where? The 10 Commandments. What chapter am I turning to read to you from the 10 Commandments? Somebody scream it out loud. Exodus chapter 20. He says, honor your father and your mother. Have you ever read the next part? That your days may be prolonged in the land. If you become a disobedient people to your mother and father, you're disobedient to God, because the Mosaic law says, honor your mother and your father. If you've become so disobedient to your parents, it's a reflection that you're already disobedient to God. And if you are disobedient to God, I'll kick you out of the land. The land is the being in the land and enjoying the blessings of the land for whatever period of time the Israelites are there is conditioned on their obedience. Israel owns the land, but whether they can live in the land at whatever time period, that's based on their obedience. One day Jesus Christ will come back as the King of Israel, sit on David's eternal throne, and will rule Israel, but only when Israel finally bows the knee to Messiah and says, you are the blessed one who comes in the name of the Lord. You are Messiah. You are Mashiach, the promised Jewish Messiah. Until then, there will be a disobedient people. They are in disobedience right now. They are not living in the land in a biblical sense, in obedience, enjoying the blessings of the land. But they try to tell God, you made a promise to Abraham. We've confessed our sins like you told us to. You made a promise to our father Abraham to give us the land. You've got to let us in. Does he? No, because they're banking on the unconditional portions of the land promise and forgetting about you have to obey to enter the land, and you have disobeyed me. You're not going into the land. Don't forget that just as God exists as perfect love, He also exists as perfect justice. And if you go against Him, there will be consequences. That balance has to be equal. Retributive justice. What does perfect justice look like? Look what it says in Numbers 14 verse 34, backing up just a little bit. What does it mean that God's balances have to be equal? The sin and the consequence have to be equal. Well, the Bible says it. Numbers 14:34, according to the number of days which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt a year, even 40 years. So God has determined 40 days you were in the land. You should have been getting fortified. Oh my word, I can't believe that God has given us this incredible land flowing with milk and honey. Look how blessed we are of God that He walks with us and provides for us so well. That should have been their mental thoughts as they're walking through the land, but instead they're getting more and more scared, except for the two, Joshua and Caleb. So God says 40 for 40. You were in the land for 40 days. I can't kill 603,000 people in 40 days, or else there would be no next generation of Israel to enter the land. He'd wipe out the men in Israel if He did that. So in God's genius, 40 for 40, but 40 days will equal 40 years in the wilderness. So the second generation can also grow and be able to take up the land. I, the Lord, have spoken. I've decreed it. I'm not going to change my mind. 40 for 40. Surely this I will do to all this evil congregation, He calls them, who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall be destroyed, and there they will die. How did the Jews respond? Remember what they did? With the arrogant thought that they can change God's mind. We'll confess our sins. We'll wake up for battle. Yahweh will almost be forced to let us into the promised land. We can force God's hand. He'll be forced to give us victory if we confess our sins and we bank on His promise that He made to our forefather. Again, don't ever try to outsmart or outmaneuver God. It will always end in disaster. Follow the mandates in the Bible. Numbers 14:41, but Moses said to these assembled Jews who think we can manipulate, we've confessed, God has made a promise, we're going to go into even though yesterday He said, deal's off, this generation isn't going in, your sons will go in, we can change all that. Moses tells these people that are assembling on the bluff, ready to go into battle, why then are you transgressing the command of the Lord when it will not succeed? He told you that you're all going to die in the wilderness. You think you can change that? The heart of man is just deceitful enough to think, yeah, I can change that. Saul's waking up and doing it right now. In 1 Samuel 31, Moses tells them, do not go up, don't go into battle, or you will be struck down before your enemies. Isn't that what Samuel told Saul? Tomorrow you go into battle, you and your sons will die in battle. So don't go into battle, or you will be struck down before your enemies, for Yahweh is not with you. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites will be there in front of you. Amalekites, interesting, same people David's still fighting. The Amalekites and the Canaanites will be there in front of you, and you, men of Israel, will fall by the sword, inasmuch as you have turned back from following the Lord. This is your choice. You did this, and the Lord will not be with you. So Yahweh has spoken through Moses that I'm not giving you the battle, I'm not giving you the victory in battle, you will die in the wilderness over the next 40 years. They assemble for battle the next day. Moses tells them again, Yahweh is not with you. If you go into battle, you will surely die. And certainly after 2 warnings from God, the Jewish men will stop, right? Or does their arrogance seem to have no bounds? Numbers 14:44 says, but despite the 2 warnings directly from God through His prophet Moses, but they went up heedlessly to the ridge of the hill. They didn't heed the warnings. Neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses left the camp. You're on your own, buddy. Y'all want to go do that? You're on your own. I'm not going. I told you what was going to happen. God has made it clear. So what happens to the arrogance of the Israelite men who think we can manipulate God's hand here? The Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and struck the Jews and beat them down as far as Hormah. Well, of course they did. That's exactly what God told them would happen. They tried to manipulate the hand of God. They tried to outsmart God, outmaneuver God. They tried to make some kind of sucker deal with God. And God said, I'm not a sucker. I can't be played. I won't be played. Remind you of any Bible verses? It just reminded me of one that jumped into my head. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, there's a famous verse. It says, I'll read it, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, what you plant, the choices you make, you will also reap. You plant obedience, you will reap blessing. You plant disobedience, what will you reap? The opposite. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. And that's exactly what the Jews in the wilderness did to God. They mocked Him. We confessed our sin and you made a promise. You have to keep it. Don't toy with this God. They found out. They found out. They messed around and found out, as they like to say today. The Amalekites and the Canaanites beat them down, struck them, and beat them down. We're not told how many of the Jewish 603,548 men died on this day, but a few of them did for sure, as God begins to keep His promise that over the next years in the wilderness, every one of you, except for Joshua and Caleb, will die in this wilderness. Every one of you will die. This generation will die in the wilderness for their disobedience. So, back to Saul. He should have known all this. He knows Jewish history. He's the king of Israel. This didn't happen thousands of years before Saul. It happened just a few hundred years before Saul. He knew Jewish history. So he should have known. He should remember his nation's history with their Creator God. He should know that he has no chance of changing God's mind, changing God's decree midstream. He should know that he will die in battle if he goes into battle. But yet what does he do? He wakes up in the morning, just like his ancestors did, puts on his armor, and marches into battle. Astounding. Another thought. The events that are taking place here, David's victory against the Amalekites in the south and Saul's death in the north on Mount Gilboa, they could be taking place at the same time. We just don't know, but they probably are taking place simultaneously. So David's in the south fighting the Amalekites, getting his wives and children back, and Saul, the Philistine army, continued to march when David went back, and they're probably in the valley of Jezreel fighting Saul at Mount Gilboa, probably all at the same time. But there's an enormous contrast here. Look at some of these thoughts. The events of David's victory, so contrast David and Saul. The events of David's victory against the Amalekites in the south and Saul's death at the hands of the Philistines in the north could be taking place at the same time. I think they are. Yahweh, God, Creator, is with David and gives him the overwhelming victory. Everything that was taken from you, I will return for you, to you. Just go into battle. I've given you the battle. Pursue them and fight them and take back what's yours and take what's theirs from them also. I'm going to give you all their spoils. God is with David and gives him an overwhelming victory. What's happening in the north at the very same time? Yahweh is not with Saul and kills him. He's with David and gives him this overwhelming victory at the very same time in human history, in the very same place, the land of Canaan, the promised land, Israel. Yahweh is not with Saul and kills him. One is blessed and one is cursed. He kills him using a Gentile pagan army of Philistines. Not a good death. Not an honorable death. Again, another contrast. David slaughters the Amalekites and they flee before him. They are in fear of David and his 600 men. He slaughters them and they run. Saul, in contrast, and his sons flee from the Philistine army, but are caught and slaughtered. Obey me. Can't get any clearer than these contrasts that God wrote into the book of 1 Samuel in these last few chapters. Obey me and be blessed. Disobey me, son, and be cursed. You choose today what you will have, blessing or cursing. I've said this several times. I'm going to read this one to you too. Write this chapter down in Deuteronomy chapter 30. In verse 15, this is what God through Moses says. He says, see, I'm in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15. The choice is yours, Israel. I have set before you today life and prosperity. Who wants that? And death and adversity. Who wants that? Here's God telling Moses, you tell Israel this, you get to choose. I've set them before you. Pick your path wisely. Because if you pick the wrong path, I am a God of perfect justice. And your sin has to be dealt with. I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God. Love God. Number 2, to walk in His ways. That means be obedient to the things that He's taught you. Obey them and do them. Live them out. And keep His commandments and His statutes and His judgments. And what's the consequence of that? That you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land. It's conditional. If you want to stay in the land, you have to be people that love the Lord your God, walk in His ways, and keep His commandments. And you will live and multiply, that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. Door number 1, we'll call it. But there's a door number 2. David, door number 1. Not perfectly. Saul, door number 2. But if your heart turns away and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, the witch of Endor that Saul went to, she's a worshiper and server of Satan. And that's exactly who Saul turned to. Saul was guilty of this. He was drawn away and he worshiped other gods and served them. He went to the dark side. He went to demonism for help. When God wouldn't answer, he went to Satan for an answer. Find Saul and bring Samuel and bring Samuel up. There's a consequence to that. I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. That's physical death. You will not, listen to what it says, you will not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it. If you want to go into the land, love me, obey me, keep my commandments. If you want to stay in the land, love me, obey me, and keep my commandments. Walk according to what I've given you to walk. When you are in the land, if you turn away from me and disobey me, you will not prolong, extend, elongate your time in the land. I'll kick you out of the land. It will always be Israel's land, but I get to choose which generation of Israel lives there and which generations I kick out and they live elsewhere in exile. That's God's promise to Israel. This is the deal. Life and prosperity, death and adversity. Israel, you choose. Free will. You choose. What do you think God wanted? A disobedient, arrogant, stiff-necked people? Or an obedient, loving people that glorified Him and worshiped Him? Of course, that's what He wanted. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life. He commands the Jewish people, choose life. It's the obvious choice. Choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants. And then He tells them, if I choose life, Lord, what does the pattern of my life look like? By loving the Lord your God, by obeying His voice, and by holding fast to Him, for this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. Yes, I've sworn to them I'll give you the land, but I, as God, as Creator, as the ultimate owner of the land, get to decide when you're a tenant in the land or whether you're not. And that's based on your obedience to me. Your love, your obedience, you're keeping my commandments. This is to Israel, not to us. And when they messed up, they didn't go into the land. So before they ever even went into the land, as we've talked about this morning, there was a condition. Love the Lord your God, obey Him, and keep His commandments. And the Jewish men in Israel did not do that. They didn't love the Lord their God. They didn't fear Him. They didn't trust Him. They didn't think He was strong enough to defeat the bigger, the giants in the fortified cities in Canaan. And so they followed the lead of the 10 fearful spies, and God said there's a consequence for that. It's all about blessing in the land or cursing outside of the land. I'm going to curse you for your disobedience. You will not go into the land. I'll give the land when I'm ready. And I'll take it from you at any time. And that's exactly what's going on here, and Saul should know it. So instead of having sense, Saul wakes up in the morning and thinks, just like his Israelite ancestors so many years before, I can do this. I can change God's mind. I can have victory in battle. We're not told what Saul's thoughts were. We're not told if he confessed his sins. We're not told exactly how he walked through this with God, but we do know for a fact that he was told by Samuel, you'll die in the morning if you pick up arms, but he did it anyway. There had to have been a similar thought process to what the Jews in the wilderness were thinking. We can manipulate God. We can change His mind. We can have our way. And God says, no, 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 not going to happen. I knew it was going to take me a while to get into 1 Samuel chapter 31 because there was a lot to say to get into it, to build it up properly. We will stop here and start in 1 Samuel chapter 31. Read ahead. It's a very short chapter. We'll easily finish it next time we're here. 13 verses. We will see Saul, the great king, the first king of the united empire of Israel, die in battle against a pagan force, the Philistines. Let's close in prayer.